This country is moving very rapidly under Trump into an authoritarian form of society. You know, the founding fathers, way back in the 1770s, these were nobody's fools. And what they had fought the King of England, an autocrat, had all the power, and they said, you know what? We don't want that in the new country. We're going to set up 3 separate equal branches of government. And every kid in the 6th grade knows who they are. But Trump does not. And what Trump is doing now is trying every day to usurp the powers of Congress, to challenge the powers of the court. It is a very dangerous moment. At the end of the day, the struggle against Trump, the struggle against oligarchy, which is led by Elon Musk.
Okay, so this is absolutely massive, and we need to talk about it right now because the White House has been thrown into complete chaos as what's being called a fatal lawsuit targets multiple senior Trump advisors and legal allies for their alleged criminal conduct and cover-ups and abuse of office. The filing, which is backed by damning digital evidence and dozens of witness statements, accuses Trump's inner circle, including former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and attorney John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani, of orchestrating efforts to overturn the 2020 election and intimidate officials and destroy government records. Sources are reporting frantic meetings and emergency legal calls and staff resignations as legal exposure mounts and conviction looms ever closer. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
The fight to make sure that the working class of this country gets a fair shake, that is not going to be won here in Capitol Hill. It's going to be won by millions of people all over this country standing up and saying, you know what? We fought and died for democracy. We're not going to move toward authoritarianism. We fought to create a country that works for all, not just the billionaire class. That's the struggle, and I'm going to be active in trying to rally the American people to do just that.
The lawsuit outlines coordinated actions to subvert elections and hide evidence and tamper with witnesses, gathering digital forensics and private meeting logs as primary proof of conspiracy. Legal filings cite over $100 million in financial penalties already levied by state courts against Giuliani and Eastman, while Mark Meadows was indicted and forced to testify under criminal threat. Multiple investigations uncovered that Trump's aides and attorneys disregarded constitutional safeguards, erasing election law enforcement at DOJ and shutting down public integrity sections to avoid detection and prosecution. The fallout has triggered staff exits and emergency damage control sessions and open panic inside the White House, with sources warning that further resignations and indictments and plea deals are imminent. The coordinated cover-ups and legal peril explain how the lawsuit leverages direct evidence, including text messages and secret meetings and cash transactions, to outline a wide-ranging conspiracy and personal legal jeopardy for Trump's inner circle. The White House political fallout details the internal panic, including resignations and emergency legal briefings, and the cascade of consequences as investigators probe deeper and allies turn on each other to save themselves. This lawsuit may mark the final unraveling of Trump's post-presidential influence because, with convictions in sight, top advisors are facing not only jail and bankruptcy, but also historic reputational damage and collapse of political power. When you have multiple senior advisors all facing serious criminal charges and massive financial penalties simultaneously, that creates a situation where Trump's ability to mount any kind of coordinated defense or political comeback becomes extremely difficult. The chaos and lawsuits and high-stakes legal peril ensure this story has explosive potential for understanding how Trump's inner circle is finally facing accountability. The digital evidence that backs this lawsuit apparently includes text messages and emails and encrypted communications that were recovered through forensic analysis and that show explicit discussions of illegal activities. Modern digital forensics can recover communications that people thought were deleted or encrypted in ways that couldn't be broken. When prosecutors have these kinds of communications showing criminal planning in the conspirators' own words, that's about as strong as evidence gets. The dozens of witness statements provide corroboration and context for the digital evidence and help establish criminal intent and consciousness of guilt. The efforts to overturn the 2020 election that are documented in the lawsuit go beyond just the fake elector scheme to include pressure campaigns on state officials and attempts to use the Justice Department to declare election fraud in coordination with members of Congress to disrupt the certification process. This comprehensive approach shows the conspiracy wasn't limited to one tactic, but rather involved multiple coordinated efforts, all designed to keep Trump in power despite losing the election. The intimidation of officials that's alleged includes threats and harassment and attempts to pressure people into taking actions they knew were illegal. The destruction of government records that's charged is particularly serious because federal law requires preservation of presidential records and communications. When officials deliberately destroy records to hide evidence of wrongdoing that's both obstruction of justice and violation of records laws, the fact that multiple Trump advisors are accused of participating in records destruction suggests this was a coordinated effort rather than isolated incidents. The frantic meetings and emergency legal calls that are happening inside the White House show that people are panicking about their personal legal exposure and trying to figure out how to protect themselves. So yeah, this is genuinely one of the most serious legal crises Trump's inner circle has faced, and we need to break down exactly who's targeted and what evidence exists and why this lawsuit is being called fatal. All right, so let's dig into the specific allegations against each of the major figures named in this lawsuit, because understanding who did what and what evidence exists is crucial to grasping why this represents such a fatal threat. Mark Meadows, who was Trump's final chief of staff, is accused of being a central coordinator of the efforts to overturn the election result. As chief of staff, Meadows had access to everyone and everything in the White House and could coordinate activities across different agencies and with outside actors. The evidence against Meadows apparently includes his own text messages and emails showing him organizing meetings and conveying Trump's wishes and participating in planning illegal activities. The indictment that forced Meadows to testify under criminal threat presumably relates to charges in Georgia or other states where he's accused of participating in election interference schemes. When someone is indicted and facing serious prison time, they often become more willing to cooperate with prosecutors to reduce their own exposure. Meadows testifying against Trump or other co-conspirators would be devastating because he has firsthand knowledge of virtually everything that happened in the White House during the critical period after the 2020 election. John Eastman, who was the attorney who authored the infamous memo about how Mike Pence could reject electoral votes, is accused of providing legal cover for what were essentially illegal actions. Lawyers have special ethical obligations, and when they use their legal expertise to facilitate crimes rather than to provide legitimate advice, they can face both criminal charges and disbarment. The $100 million plus in financial penalties that have been levied against Eastman presumably relate to defamation judgments and sanctions in various cases where his conduct was found to be legally or ethically improper. Eastman's financial ruin from these penalties makes him potentially vulnerable to cooperation with prosecutors because he may conclude he has nothing left to lose. When someone is already facing financial devastation, adding criminal charges and potential prison time may push them toward cooperation as their only realistic option. The fact that Eastman has already been sanctioned in multiple cases for frivolous legal arguments and misconduct shows courts have concluded his conduct went far beyond zealous advocacy into unethical and illegal territory. Rudy Giuliani, who was Trump's personal attorney and point person for many of the election overturn efforts, is accused of coordinating the fake elector scheme and pressure campaigns on state officials and spreading disinformation about election fraud. Giuliani's legal and financial problems have been mounting for years, including defamation judgments in favor of election workers. He falsely accused of fraud. The $100 million plus in penalties against Giuliani has essentially bankrupted him and destroyed his once illustrious reputation. The digital forensics and private meeting logs that document the conspiracy apparently include recordings or detailed notes from meetings where Trump and his inner circle discussed illegal strategies. Having contemporaneous documentation of criminal planning is incredibly powerful evidence because it shows what was said before anyone knew they might face legal consequences. When people are planning crimes, they're often quite explicit about what they're doing and why, because they don't expect their private conversations to become public. The coordinated actions to subvert elections that are documented show this wasn't just Trump acting alone or with one or two advisors, but rather a comprehensive conspiracy involving dozens of people across multiple states and institutions. The coordination is evidenced by the timing of various activities and the similarity of approaches in different states and communications, showing people working together toward common goals. When prosecutors can prove this level of coordination, they can bring conspiracy charges against numerous defendants and use cooperation from lower-level participants to reach higher-level decision-makers. The efforts to hide evidence and tamper with witnesses show consciousness of guilt and ongoing obstruction. If the conspirators believed their actions were legal, they wouldn't need to hide evidence or pressure witnesses. The fact that they took active steps to obstruct investigations demonstrates they understood they had done something wrong. Obstruction and witness tampering are often easier to prove than the underlying crimes because the evidence is more recent and there are more witnesses to the obstructive acts. The cash transactions that are referenced apparently involve payments to fake electors or to people who agreed to pressure state officials or to witnesses who might have damaging information. When conspirators use cash rather than traceable electronic payments, that suggests they're trying to hide the transactions from law enforcement, but even cash transactions often leave evidence through bank withdrawals and deposits and surveillance footage and witness testimony about payments being made. The disregard for constitutional safeguards that investigators uncovered shows Trump's team wasn't just aggressive in pursuing their goals, but actively worked to undermine the legal and constitutional protections that are supposed to constrain government power. This includes things like ignoring court orders and defying congressional subpoenas and pressuring the Justice Department to take actions that would violate its independence. When officials systematically disregard constitutional limits, they're essentially rejecting the rule of law in favor of rule by personal power. The erasure of election law enforcement at DOJ that's alleged apparently involves Trump and his allies trying to remove or sideline Justice Department officials who were responsible for ensuring election integrity and prosecuting election crimes. If the people whose job is to prosecute election fraud are removed or prevented from doing their jobs, that makes it much easier to commit election fraud without consequences. This kind of systematic undermining of law enforcement is evidence of criminal intent because it shows efforts to avoid accountability. The shutting down of public integrity sections that's referenced presumably relates to efforts to eliminate or defund the parts of DOJ that investigate government corruption and election crimes. Public integrity sections exist specifically to hold government officials accountable when they abuse their power. Eliminating these sections makes it much harder to investigate and prosecute official corruption, which is exactly what you'd expect criminals in government to want to do. The staff exits that have been triggered by this lawsuit show that people who've been working in or around Trump's orbit are deciding it's not worth the legal risk to continue. When staff start fleeing, that suggests they either know damaging information they don't want to be asked about, or they see the writing on the wall and want to distance themselves before things get worse. Mass staff departures also make it harder for Trump to function politically because he loses institutional knowledge and loyal supporters. The emergency damage control sessions that are happening presumably involve lawyers trying to figure out legal strategies and political advisors trying to figure out messaging and everyone trying to assess who might flip and cooperate with prosecutors. These kinds of emergency meetings are typically chaotic and stressful because everyone is worried about protecting themselves rather than working together toward common goals. Trust breaks down when people face serious legal jeopardy, which makes coordination much harder. So let's talk about what happens next and what the realistic outcomes are for the various people targeted in this fatal lawsuit, because the consequences they face are genuinely severe and likely to reshape American politics. The most immediate question is whether any of the major figures like Meadows or Giuliani or Eastman decide to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges or sentences. Cooperation agreements typically require defendants to provide truthful testimony about everything they know, including testimony against higher-level conspirators like Trump. The decision about whether to cooperate is agonizing because it requires betraying former allies, but when you're facing decades in prison, cooperation starts looking more attractive. If Meadows cooperates, that would be especially devastating for Trump because Meadows was present for virtually every important conversation and decision during the relevant time period. He can testify about what Trump said and what Trump knew and what Trump intended, which are often the hardest elements for prosecutors to prove. Without insider witnesses, Meadows' cooperation could also implicate numerous other people in Trump's orbit who coordinated with him on various aspects of the conspiracy. If Giuliani or Eastman cooperate, they can provide detailed testimony about the legal strategies that were developed in the communications with state officials and the fake elector schemes. Both have already suffered enormous financial and reputational damage, so cooperation might be seen as a way to limit further losses. However, both have also been quite loyal to Trump publicly, which makes cooperation a harder decision emotionally, even if it makes sense strategically. The 100 million plus in financial penalties that have already been levied make both Giuliani and Eastman essentially judgment-proof because they don't have resources to pay such massive amounts. This financial devastation might make them more willing to cooperate because they have less to lose. Conversely, it might make prosecutors less interested in their cooperation if they think Giuliani and Eastman will just lie to protect Trump because they have nothing left to lose. The further resignations that sources warn are imminent will likely include people who haven't yet been publicly implicated, but who fear they might be as investigations continue. Preemptive resignation allows people to distance themselves and maybe avoid scrutiny, but it also creates the appearance of guilt. Every resignation generates new speculation about what that person knows and whether they might cooperate with investigators. The further indictments that are predicted will probably target people who were involved in specific aspects of the conspiracy, like fake electors in various states or state officials who assisted with pressure campaigns. As lower-level conspirators are indicted, they face decisions about whether to cooperate and testify against those above them. This creates pressure that works its way up the conspiracy chain, potentially reaching Trump himself. The plea deals that are expected to come involve defendants agreeing to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for cooperation or in exchange for avoiding trial. Plea deals are attractive to prosecutors because they guarantee convictions without the risk of acquittals at trial. They're attractive to defendants because they typically result in lower sentences than defendants would receive if convicted at trial. The timing in terms of plea deals will provide insight into what prosecutors think they can prove and what testimony they're trying to secure. The collapse of political power that Trump is experiencing as his inner circle faces legal jeopardy makes it much harder for him to maintain influence within the Republican Party or to mount another presidential campaign. When your closest advisors are in prison or cooperating against you or financially ruined, it becomes very difficult to attract talented people to work for you going forward. Political power depends partly on the perception that associating with you advances rather than destroys careers. The historic reputational damage that figures like Giuliani have suffered is essentially irreversible. Giuliani went from being America's mayor after 9/11 to being a disbarred lawyer facing prison and bankruptcy. That kind of fall from grace becomes a permanent part of your legacy that overshadows any earlier accomplishments. The reputational damage affects not just the individuals, but their families and anyone else closely associated with them. The jail time that many of these figures are facing could be substantial depending on the specific charges and whether sentences run concurrently or consecutively. Federal sentencing guidelines for conspiracy and obstruction and fraud can result in years or decades in prison, especially when there are multiple counts and aggravating factors like abuse of positions of trust. Even defendants who cooperate typically receive some prison time, though usually much less than they would have received without cooperation. The bankruptcy that Giuliani and potentially others face creates additional complications because bankruptcy trustees might try to access any potential book deals or speaking fees or other income streams to pay creditors. This makes it harder for defendants to monetize their stories or experiences even after they serve their sentences. Financial ruin can extend long beyond any prison sentences, particularly when judgments are for amounts that could never realistically be paid off. So where does this leave us as we watch Trump's inner circle face this fatal lawsuit and the White House erupt in chaos? We have multiple senior advisors facing serious criminal charges backed by strong digital evidence and witness testimony. We have over 100 million in financial penalties already levied against key figures. We have Meadows indicted and forced to testify under threat. We have coordinated efforts to subvert elections and destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses, all documented. We have the Justice Department's public integrity functions undermined systematically. We have frantic meetings and emergency legal consultations and staff fleeing. We have warnings of further indictments and plea deals and cooperation coming. We have the collapse of Trump's political power as his inner circle crumbles. And we have historic reputational damage and potential for decades in prison facing the people who were closest to Trump during the most critical period. This fatal lawsuit represents the chickens coming home to roost for people who believed they could participate in a conspiracy to overturn an election without facing consequences. The evidence appears overwhelming and the legal strategies are limited, leaving defendants with difficult choices about whether to cooperate or fight. The White House chaos reflects recognition that this isn't just another lawsuit that can be dismissed or settled, but rather a fundamental threat to everyone involved. The coordination that made the conspiracy possible now becomes evidence of criminal liability, as prosecutors work their way through the organization, indicting lower-level participants and pressing them to cooperate against higher-ups. Whether Trump himself ultimately faces charges depends partly on what his inner circle says when they're forced to choose between loyalty and freedom. But regardless of what happens to Trump, the destruction of his inner circle's lives and careers and reputations is already well underway and appears irreversible for most of them.